The parchment felt too fine between Nara Greenfield's calloused fingers, the kind of paper that had never known a day's honest work. And she turned it over twice looking for the joke, before accepting that someone had actually sent her an engraved invitation to the Thornley Estate harvest feast. She sat at her small kitchen table in the cottage she rented at the edge of Millbrook Village, watching autumn rain streak down the single window, and tried to imagine what sort of mistake would result in her name appearing in careful script beneath a wax seal. Orc women did not receive invitations to harvest feasts held by wealthy landholders. Orc women received suspicious glances at the market and silence when they entered shops, and the occasional muttered comment about why someone like her did not simply go back where she came from, even though she had been born 3 miles from this very spot. The invitation sat on her table for 2 days while she weighed her options. She could ignore it, let the error pass without comment, and continue her quiet life tending the small orchard plot she leased from old farmer Hendrick. She could burn it and pretend it had never arrived. Or she could do what her mother had always told her to do when faced with something that made no sense. Walk straight toward it and demand an explanation. On the 3rd day, she put on her least patched dress, the gray wool one that had belonged to her mother, and walked the 4 miles to the Thornley estate under skies that threatened more rain. The road wound through harvested fields where stubble poked through mud, past stone walls thick with moss, and finally through an iron gate that stood open as if expecting her. The manor house rose before her like something from a story, 3 stories of golden stone with mullioned windows that reflected the gray afternoon. Servants moved across the grounds preparing for the evening's feast, hanging lanterns and carrying crates of wine, and more than one stopped to stare as she approached the main entrance. She felt their eyes on her green skin, on the small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw, on the pointed tips of her ears visible beneath her braided black hair. A butler answered her knock, his face arranging itself into professional blankness when he saw what stood on the doorstep. "I received this," Nara said, holding up the invitation. "I believe there has been some mistake. I am here to return it and save your master the embarrassment of having sent it to the wrong person." The butler took the invitation, examined it, and then did something unexpected. He smiled. "No mistake, Miss Greenfield. The master has been hoping you would come. Please follow me." She almost turned and walked away then. Almost. But curiosity had always been her weakness, and she wanted to know what sort of game was being played before she removed herself from it. So she followed the butler through halls paneled in dark wood, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge her from their frames, and into a study lined with books where a man stood at the window watching the rain begin to fall. He turned when she entered, and she had a moment to take in his appearance before he spoke. Tall, perhaps 30 years to her 24, with dark hair touched with early gray at the temples, and the sort of face that might have been handsome if it smiled more often. He wore good clothes without ostentation, a dark coat over a simple linen shirt, and his hands were clean but showed old calluses that spoke of work done at some point in his past. "Miss Greenfield," he said, and then he did smile, a genuine expression that reached his gray eyes and transformed his entire face. "Thank you for coming. I am Dorian Thornley. I came to tell you that you sent your invitation to the wrong person," Nara said, keeping her voice level despite the strange flutter in her chest at that smile. "I assume you meant to invite someone else named Greenfield. There are 3 human families by that name in the area." "I meant to invite you," Dorian said. "The orchardist who leases land from Hendrick. The woman who grew those remarkable apple varieties that Hendrick has been selling at the market for the past 2 seasons. the only person in 3 counties who seems to understand that fruit trees require more than simply being stuck in the ground and hoped over. Nara stared at him. "You invited me to your harvest feast because of apples." "I invited you because I need your help," Dorian said, and the smile faded into something more serious. "And because I believe in sitting down to table with people I hope to do business with. Will you stay for the feast tonight? I promise the food will be excellent, and afterward I would very much like to discuss a proposition with you." "A proposition," Nara repeated slowly. Regarding orchards, he confirmed. "My estate has 12 acres of fruit trees that have been producing poorly for the past 5 years. 2 different consultants have looked at them and suggested everything from replacing the soil to cutting them all down and starting fresh. I have spent a small fortune following their advice, and the harvests only grow worse. Then I tasted one of your apples at the market, and Hendrik told me that you had taken his dying trees and brought them back to full production in 2 seasons. So yes, I invited you because of apples, and if that seems an odd reason for a social invitation, perhaps it is, but I find I care less about social convention than I do about saving my orchards." There was something in his voice when he spoke that last sentence, an edge of bitterness or old pain, that made Nara look at him more closely. She had spent her entire life reading people's faces for signs of mockery or threat, and she found neither in Dorian Thornley's expression. What she found instead was exhaustion, determination, and a kind of desperate hope that he was trying to hide. "If you want to discuss business, we can do that without me attending your feast," Nara said. "I am sure your other guests would be more comfortable without an orc woman at the table." "My other guests' comfort is not my primary concern," Dorian said. "My orchards are dying, Miss Greenfield. I need someone who can save them, and I need to know that I can trust that person enough to give them relatively free rein over a significant portion of my estate. Breaking bread together seems a reasonable place to start building that trust. Unless you find the prospect of spending an evening in my company so objectionable that you would rather walk 4 miles home in the rain and turn down what I assure you would be very generous compensation." Nara felt something shift in her chest, a careful rearrangement of assumptions. He was not mocking her. He genuinely wanted her there, wanted her help, and was willing to seat her at his table in front of whatever local gentry he had invited to impress or court favor with. It was possibly the most foolish thing she had ever seen a human landowner do, and it made her curious enough to agree. "I will stay," she said. "But if someone throws food at me, I am leaving and you can find another orchardist." Dorian's smile returned, smaller this time but warmer. "If anyone throws food at you in my house, they will be leaving long before you will. I promise you that." The feast began at sunset in a dining hall lit by candles and a roaring fireplace that pushed back the autumn chill. Nara had been given a room to wait in beforehand, and a maid had appeared with a basin of warm water and a shy offer to help her refresh herself. She had washed her face and hands, rebraided her hair, and tried not to look at herself too long in the mirror on the wall. She knew what she looked like. She did not need the reminder that she would stand out among Dorian's guests, like a wolf among sheep. When the butler came to escort her to the dining hall, she steeled herself for stares and whispers, and the particular kind of silence that fell when people saw something they found distasteful, but were too polite to comment on directly. What she was not prepared for was Dorian meeting her at the entrance to the hall and offering her his arm as if she were a fine lady instead of an orc woman in a patched wool dress. "Miss Greenfield," he said quietly, "may I?" She looked at his offered arm, at his steady gray eyes, and made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. She took his arm, and he led her into the hall. The conversations faltered as they entered. Nara counted perhaps 20 guests seated along the long table, local landowners and their wives dressed in their finest clothes, and every single one of them turned to stare. She felt Dorian's arm tense slightly beneath her hand, but his expression remained calm and welcoming as he led her to a seat near the head of the table. "Everyone, this is Miss Nara Greenfield," Dorian said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden quiet. "An orchardist of considerable skill, and someone whose expertise I hope to benefit from in the coming seasons. Miss Greenfield, please allow me to introduce you to my neighbors." He went through the names, and Nara nodded politely to each blank or startled face. Lady Cecilia Wainwright, who clutched her wine glass so hard her knuckles whitened. Lord Edmund Fairfax, whose expression suggested he had bitten into something sour. Thomas and Margaret Sutton, who at least managed weak smiles. On and on, a litany of people who clearly had no idea how to react to finding themselves sharing a meal with an orc. Dorian took his own seat at the head of the table and signaled for the first course to be served. The soup arrived in fine porcelain bowls, rich and fragrant with herbs, and for several minutes the only sounds were the clink of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Finally, Lady Wainwright cleared her throat. "Master Thornley, I was not aware you had expanded your social circle so broadly." "I try to surround myself with people of actual ability, Lady Wainwright," Dorian said mildly. "I find it makes for more interesting conversation than simply recycling the same tired gossip year after year." A flush crept up Lady Wainwright's powdered cheeks. Across from Nara, Margaret Sutton made a small noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. "And what brings you to the Thornley estate, Miss Greenfield?" Thomas Sutton asked. He seemed genuinely curious rather than hostile, which was something. "Master Thornley wishes to discuss the possibility of my working with his orchards," Nara said. "They are underperforming, I understand." "Underperforming is generous," Dorian said. "Last year's apple harvest was barely enough to make cider for the household. The pear trees produced almost nothing. At this rate, I will be cutting them down within 2 years simply to make room for something useful." "Have you tried grafting?" Nara asked, forgetting for a moment where she was. "Sometimes old rootstock can support new growth if you choose the right varieties, and your soil may be depleted. Fruit trees are hungry things. They take and take from the earth, and if you do not give back, eventually there is nothing left for them to draw on." Dorian leaned forward, his dinner forgotten. "I had someone add manure to the soil last spring. It made no difference." "Manure is a start, but it is not enough for trees that have been struggling for years. You need to rebuild the soil's strength from the ground up. Compost, yes, but also bone meal, wood ash, perhaps green manure crops between the rows if there is space. And you need to look at each tree individually, see what it is trying to tell you. Are the leaves yellowed? Are there cankers on the bark? Is the fruit dropping before it ripens? Each symptom has a different cause, and each cause requires a different solution." "You speak as if the trees are patients in a sick room," Lord Fairfax said, his tone making it clear he thought this was foolishness. "They are living things," Nara said, turning to look at him directly. "They grow, they struggle, they die. If you cannot see them as anything more than objects that exist to produce fruit for you, then you will never understand why they fail. A tree knows when it is cared for. It responds to attention the same way any living thing does." "How remarkably sentimental," Lady Wainwright murmured. "How remarkably sensible," Dorian countered. "Every gardener worth the name knows that plants thrive under the care of someone who pays attention to them. Miss Greenfield, would you be willing to look at my orchards tomorrow? I can have a horse prepared for you if you wish to ride the property." I can walk, Nara said. I will see more on foot anyway, and I will need to touch the trees, examine the bark and leaves, dig into the soil around the roots. You cannot diagnose a problem from horseback. Tomorrow morning, then, I will show you the orchards myself. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of courses and conversation. Some of the guests warmed slightly as the wine flowed. Others remained coldly polite, but Dorian kept the conversation moving and deflected the worst of the barbed comments with a skill that spoke of long practice. Nara found herself relaxing slightly, drawn into a discussion about grafting techniques with Thomas Sutton, who admitted his own estate's apple trees could use improvement. When the final course had been cleared and the guests began to make their farewells, Lady Wainwright paused beside Dorian's chair. "A word of advice, Master Thornley," she said, her voice low but not so low that Nara could not hear. "There are some boundaries that, once crossed, are difficult to uncross. I do hope you are not making a decision you will come to regret." "The only decision I regret, Lady Wainwright, is wasting 5 years listening to consultants who know less about fruit trees than they do about flying," Dorian said. "But I appreciate your concern." Lady Wainwright's mouth thinned into a line, and she swept out with her skirts rustling indignation. When the last guest had departed, Dorian turned to Nara with a look of tired satisfaction. "Well, that went better than I feared and worse than I hoped. Thank you for staying." "Your Lady Wainwright does not approve of me," Nara said. "Lady Wainwright does not approve of anything that disrupts her sense of proper order. She once spent 20 minutes berating me because I allowed my tenants to glean the fields after harvest instead of keeping the leavings for myself. She believes the world should be arranged in a strict hierarchy with people like her at the top, and she becomes deeply uncomfortable when someone suggests that hierarchy might be arbitrary nonsense." Nara studied his face, seeing again that flash of old bitterness. "You do not care much for her opinion." "I do not care much for anyone's opinion when it comes to how I run my estate or who I choose to associate with," Dorian said. "I learned that lesson a long time ago, the hard way." He did not elaborate, and Nara did not press. She had her own hard lessons in her past, her own scars from being judged and found wanting simply for what she was. "I should return to my cottage," she said. "It is late, and I have a long walk ahead of me." "Stay the night," Dorian said quickly. "I have more guest rooms than I know what to do with, and I would not send anyone out on these roads after dark. Besides, if you are here, we can start looking at the orchards first thing in the morning." Nara hesitated, then nodded. It was practical, and she was tired, and something about the way he had defended her to his guests made her want to trust him. The maid showed her to a room that was larger than her entire cottage, with a bed piled high with quilts and a view over the darkened grounds. Nara lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain drum against the windows and trying to understand what had happened that evening. A human landowner had invited her to his table, had seated her among his peers, had smiled at her as if she were someone worthy of respect. It made no sense. And yet it had happened. In the morning, Dorian was waiting for her in the entrance hall dressed in work clothes, sturdy boots and a coat that had seen better days. He looked younger somehow, less formal, and when he smiled at her in greeting, Nara felt that strange flutter in her chest again. "Ready to see the disaster I have been attempting to manage?" he asked. "Show me," Nara said. The orchards lay to the east of the manor house, 12 acres of trees arranged in neat rows that must have been beautiful once. Now they looked tired, their branches sparse and bark mottled with disease. Nara walked slowly between the rows, stopping to examine leaves, to scrape away bark and check for pests. to dig her fingers into the soil and bring up handfuls of earth that crumbled too easily. Dorian followed in silence, watching her work, and only spoke when she paused before a particularly struggling pear tree. "Can they be saved?" he asked quietly. "Most of them," Nara said. "This one is too far gone. It needs to come down before whatever is killing it spreads. But the others, yes. It will take time and work, but they can recover." "How much time?" 2 years before you see significant improvement. 3 before the harvests return to what they should be. You have been starving these trees, Master Thornley. Not intentionally, but the result is the same. The soil is exhausted, the trees are riddled with pests and disease, and no one has properly pruned them in years. It is salvageable, but it will require consistent effort. And you can provide that effort. Nara turned to face him fully. "I can. But it would mean being here regularly, perhaps living on the estate for portions of the year to monitor their progress. It would mean you trusting me with a significant investment of resources and time. And it would mean your neighbors seeing you employ an orc woman in a position of some authority on your lands. After last night, I think you understand what that might cost you socially." Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving over the struggling trees. "5 years ago," he said finally, "I was briefly engaged to a merchant's daughter from Millbrook. Her name was Catherine, and she was beautiful and clever, and I was young enough to think that love was sufficient foundation for a marriage. I brought her to meet my neighbors, introduced her at a dinner much like last night's feast, and do you know what they did?" Nara shook her head. "They froze her out. Politely, of course. Always politely. But they made it clear that a merchant's daughter was not good enough for the Thornley estate, that I was lowering myself by associating with someone from trade. Lady Wainwright actually took me aside and told me I was making a mockery of my family name. And I, fool that I was, I listened. I broke off the engagement. I told Catherine that I had made a mistake, that we did not suit, and I sent her back to her father's house." His voice was flat, carefully devoid of emotion, but Nara heard the pain beneath it. "She married someone else within the year," Dorian continued. "A merchant's son who did not care about stupid social hierarchies. I saw her at market once afterward, and she looked happy. Happier than I had ever made her. And I learned something from that experience, Miss Greenfield. I learned that the opinions of people like Lady Wainwright are worth precisely nothing if they prevent me from making choices that might actually improve my life or my estate. So yes, I understand what it might cost me socially to employ you, and I find I do not care." Nara felt something shift and settle in her chest, a cautious warmth toward this strange man who seemed determined to make decisions based on sense rather than social pressure. "Then we should discuss terms," she said. They worked out an agreement over the next hour, walking the orchard rows while Nara pointed out problems, and Dorian took notes in a leather journal. She would come 3 days a week to start, more when the heavy work of pruning and soil amendment began. He would provide materials and pay her a wage that made her breath catch when he named the figure. In exchange, she would restore his orchards to full production within 3 years. "And if I fail?" Nara asked as they shook hands on the arrangement. "Then I will be no worse off than I am now," Dorian said. "But you will not fail. I have a sense about these things." Over the following weeks, Nara fell into a rhythm of work on the Thornley estate. She would arrive at dawn 3 days a week, and often she would find Dorian already waiting, ready to help with whatever heavy labor was needed. He was not afraid of hard work, she discovered. He would haul wheelbarrows of compost, help her prune away dead branches, dig trenches for irrigation without complaint. They worked side by side in comfortable silence or easy conversation, and slowly the orchards began to respond. The other 4 days she spent at her own small plot, tending the trees she had nurtured from saplings, and selling her apples at market. People still stared, still whispered, but word had spread that she was working for the Thornley estate, and some of the worst hostility had faded into mere suspicion. One cold morning in late autumn, Nara arrived to find Dorian standing in the orchard with a troubled expression. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Come with me." He led her to the western edge of the orchard where 3 trees stood with their bark stripped and gouged. "Dear?" Nara asked, crouching to examine the damage. "Something with hands," Dorian said grimly. "This was done with tools. Someone came onto my land last night and deliberately damaged these trees." Nara felt anger rise hot in her throat. She knew exactly what message this was meant to send. "You should dismiss me," she said, standing, "before this escalates further." "Absolutely not," Dorian said. "This is precisely the kind of petty cruelty I expected from some corners. We will repair what we can, protect the remaining trees, and continue our work. I will not be bullied into making decisions about my own estate by vandals too cowardly to even show their faces. This could get worse." "Then it gets worse. I am not sending you away, Nara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it from his lips made her look up sharply. He met her gaze steadily, and she saw determination there, and anger, and something else she was afraid to name. "We should set a watch at night," she said finally. "At least until whoever did this realizes they will not change your mind." They hired 2 men from the village to patrol the orchards after dark, and there were no more incidents. The damaged trees recovered slowly, and the work continued. Winter came, and with it the heavy labor of pruning. Nara taught Dorian which branches to cut, how to shape each tree for optimal growth, and they spent long days in the cold with saws and shears while their breath misted in the air. On the worst days, Dorian would insist she come inside for hot tea and food, and they would sit in his study talking about grafting techniques or soil chemistry or nothing in particular. Nara found herself looking forward to those moments almost as much as the work itself. Dorian was easy to talk to, quick to laugh at himself, genuinely interested in her knowledge and opinions. He would ask her advice on estate matters that had nothing to do with orchards, and actually listen to her answers. He treated her like a colleague, like a friend, and it was so different from what she was accustomed to that sometimes she had to remind herself not to read too much into his kindness. But there were moments when she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, a softness around his eyes that made her heart beat faster. And there were moments when their hands would brush reaching for the same tool, and he would still for just a second before pulling away. She told herself she was imagining things. Men like Dorian Thornley did not develop feelings for orc women, no matter how many meals they shared or hours they worked together. He was lonely, that was all, isolated by his wealth and his refusal to bow to social pressure. She was convenient company and useful besides. But then came the day in early spring when everything shifted. They were in the orchard examining the first buds beginning to swell on the branches, a promise of the bloom to come, and Dorian was grinning with delight at the abundance of them. "Look at this," he said, touching a cluster of buds gently. "I have not seen this many buds on these trees in 5 years. Nara, this is going to be an incredible harvest." "If the weather cooperates and the bees do their work," Nara cautioned, but she was smiling too. The trees looked healthier than they had in months, their bark clean and buds fat with potential. "We should celebrate," Dorian said suddenly. "A proper celebration, not just tea in my study. Let me take you to dinner at the inn in Millbrook." Nara's smile faded. "That would not be wise." "Why not?" Because people will talk, they will assume things, and you have already dealt with enough gossip on my account. I do not care what people assume, Dorian said. I want to have dinner with you, not as employer and employee, not as landowner and orchardist. Just as two people who enjoy each other's company. Is that really so terrible? It is not terrible, Nara said quietly. It is dangerous. For you more than me. I have already faced the worst of what people think about orcs, but you could lose more than you realize. I told you about Catherine, Dorian said. About how I let other people's opinions cost me something that mattered. I will not make that mistake again. This is different. Catherine was human. I am not. I know what you are, Dorian said, and there was something fierce in his voice now. You are the woman who saved my orchards. The woman who works harder than anyone I have ever met. The woman who listens when I talk and makes me laugh and does not care that I made a fool of myself over a failed engagement 5 years ago. You are stubborn and brilliant, and you have these small tusks that show when you smile properly, which you do not do often enough. And if you think I have not noticed any of that because of the color of your skin or the shape of your ears, then you have not been paying attention. Nara stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. Dorian, I am making a mess of this, he said. I practiced what I was going to say and it all sounded much better in my head. The point is, I would very much like to take you to dinner. Not because I am grateful for your work, though I am. Not because I want to make some grand social statement, though I do not mind that either. But because I have been half in love with you since you told Lady Wainwright that trees are living things that respond to care, and I would like to see where this feeling might lead if you give it a chance. The orchard was very quiet around them, just the whisper of wind through branches beginning to leaf, and the distant call of a bird. Nara felt as if the ground had tilted beneath her feet, as if the whole world had rearranged itself while she was not looking. You cannot be in love with me, she said. That is not how this works. And yet I am, Dorian said. If that is unwelcome, tell me now and I will never mention it again. We can continue working together exactly as we have been. But if there is any chance that you might feel something similar, then I am asking you to have dinner with me. Nara thought about all the reasons she should say no. She thought about Lady Wainwright's tight-lipped disapproval, and the vandalized trees, and the long history of humans who had made it clear that orcs were not welcome in their world. She thought about Dorian's story of Catherine, about how he had let social pressure cost him happiness once before. And then she thought about how he had smiled at her that first day in his study, about how he had seated her at his table among his peers, about how he had worked beside her in the orchard without ever once making her feel lesser. One dinner, she said, at the inn. But if people throw things, I am leaving and taking you with me. Dorian's face lit up with a joy so pure it made her chest ache. One dinner, he agreed, and I will throw things back if necessary. The inn at Millbrook was a sturdy stone building with low ceilings and a fire always burning in the great hearth. Nara had been inside exactly once, 3 years ago, and the landlord had made it clear that her coin was accepted but her presence was not welcomed. She had not returned since. When she and Dorian arrived that evening, the common room fell silent in the same way the harvest feast had. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, and Nara felt the weight of judgment settle over her like a physical thing. Dorian either did not notice or did not care. He led her to a table near the fire, held her chair for her as if she were a fine lady, and ordered them both the house specialty with such cheerful confidence that the serving girl could do nothing but nod and retreat to the kitchen. Everyone is staring, Nara murmured. Let them, Dorian said. I find I am only interested in one person's company tonight. The food arrived, and it was good, thick stew and fresh bread and ale that actually tasted like something other than old socks. They ate and talked, and slowly the other patrons returned to their own conversations, though Nara could still feel sidelong glances in their direction. Thomas Sutton came over near the end of the meal, his expression uncertain. "Master Thornley, Miss Greenfield, I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all," Dorian said. "Join us if you like." Thomas pulled up a chair, ordered himself an ale, and then looked at Nara directly. "I wanted to ask if you might be willing to look at my estate's orchards," he said. "After what you have done for Thornley's trees, well, I would be a fool not to seek your expertise." "I have been telling him to hire you for weeks," Margaret Sutton added, appearing at her husband's shoulder. "Our apple trees are practically dying, and Thomas keeps insisting he can manage them himself." "I can look at them," Nara said, surprised. "Though my work for Master Thornley takes most of my time currently." "Whatever you can spare," Thomas said, "and we would pay your full rate, naturally." They talked business for a few minutes, and then the Suttons left and Nara was alone with Dorian again. "That was unexpected," she said. "Good work speaks for itself," Dorian said. "People can be slow to recognize it, but they do eventually. You are building a reputation, Nara. People are starting to see you for what you are instead of what they assumed you were." "And what am I?" "Someone remarkable," Dorian said quietly. "Someone I am extremely fortunate to know." They walked back to the estate together under stars that burned cold and bright in the spring sky. Dorian offered her his arm, and this time she took it without hesitation. When they reached the manor house, he paused at the door. "Thank you for having dinner with me," he said. "It was the best evening I have had in longer than I can remember." "We ate stew and got stared at by half the village," Nara pointed out. "Exactly," Dorian said, and his smile was soft in the darkness. "It was perfect." She stayed the night again, in the same guest room as before, and lay awake wondering what she was doing. Dorian Thornley was a good man, a kind man, but that did not change the reality of what they were. He was a wealthy landowner with a name and a reputation to maintain. She was an orc woman who would always be seen as other, as lesser, as someone who did not belong in his world. But when she finally slept, she dreamed of apple blossoms and gray eyes and hands that touched her as if she were precious. Spring turned to summer, and the orchards bloomed in a riot of white and pink flowers that had the bees working frantically. Dorian hired extra workers to help with the fruit set, and Nara spent long days directing their efforts to ensure pollination was maximized. The trees responded to all the months of careful tending, and soon small green fruits began to swell on every branch. Dorian was beside himself with excitement, dragging Nara through the rows daily to show her the progress. "Look at this pear tree," he would say. "Just look at it. It has more fruit than I have seen in a decade." "Do not count your harvest before the fruit is picked," Nara would caution, but she was pleased too. The orchard was transforming before their eyes, becoming what it should have been all along. Her work with Dorian had become an open secret in the area, and 2 more landowners had approached her about consulting on their orchards. She was making more money than she had ever dreamed of, enough that she was able to save for the first time in her life. But more than the money, she was building something that felt dangerously close to a real place in the community. People still stared, still whispered, but some of the hostility had faded into reluctant acceptance. The baker in Millbrook had started nodding to her when she came into the shop. The blacksmith had actually smiled at her last week. And Dorian made no secret of the fact that he enjoyed her company, that he valued her opinions, that he considered her a friend at minimum. They had shared several more dinners at the inn, and he had started appearing at her cottage on her days off with transparent excuses about needing to discuss orchard business. You could just say you want to visit, Nara told him one afternoon when he showed up claiming he needed her advice on a drainage issue that could easily have waited until her next scheduled day. But then you might turn me away, Dorian said. Orchard business is important. You cannot refuse to discuss important business. You are ridiculous. I am tactical, Dorian corrected, and then he grinned at her in a way that made her want to kiss him. She did not kiss him. She made him tea instead, and they sat in her tiny cottage talking until the sun set, and he finally, reluctantly, took his leave. But she thought about kissing him after he left. She thought about it a great deal. Summer deepened, and the fruits on the trees grew heavy and ripe. Dorian began planning for the harvest feast this year with even more enthusiasm than before. It will be a true celebration, he said. A harvest worth celebrating for the first time in years. You will come, of course. Of course, Nara agreed, though she felt a twist of anxiety at the thought. The first feast had been difficult enough, and that was before Dorian had made his interest in her so obvious. This time, people would be watching for something to criticize, but Dorian seemed unconcerned. He threw himself into preparations with single-minded focus, and when Nara asked him why this feast seemed so important to him, he just smiled mysteriously and said she would see. The week before the feast, Lady Wainwright appeared at the estate. Nara was in the orchard checking on the ripening apples when she saw the fine carriage pull up to the manor house, and something in her gut told her this was not a social call. She waited in the orchard, continuing her work, until Dorian came to find her an hour later. His face was set in hard lines, his jaw tight with anger. "What happened?" Nara asked. "Lady Wainwright came to offer me advice," Dorian said, his voice clipped. "She has heard rumors that I intend to make some sort of announcement at the harvest feast. She wanted to warn me that such an announcement, if it involved a certain orchardist of non-human extraction, would be met with significant social consequences. She was very specific about those consequences. Invitations withdrawn, business opportunities closed, my name becoming a subject of ridicule and pity throughout the county." Nara felt her heart sink. "She is probably right." "I do not care if she is right," Dorian said. "I told her that my choices regarding my estate and my personal life were none of her concern, and that she was welcome to withdraw her own invitations and business if it pleased her. I also told her that I had learned long ago that the opinions of small-minded people were worth exactly nothing, and that I regretted wasting even an hour of my life worrying about what people like her thought of me. Dorian, you need to think about this carefully. If the other landowners turn against you, then I will manage," Dorian interrupted. "I have good land, productive estates, and the best orchardist in 3 counties working for me. I do not need their approval or their business. What I need is to stop living my life according to rules set by people who care more about appearances than substance." "What announcement were you planning to make?" Nara asked quietly. Dorian looked at her, and some of the anger faded from his expression, replaced by something tender and determined. "I was going to seat you at the head of the table," he said, "beside me, as my honored guest and partner in the restoration of these orchards. I was going to make it clear to everyone present that you are important to me, that your work has saved my estate, and that anyone who wishes to do business with me in the future will have to accept that you are part of my household." "That is not an announcement, that is a declaration of war against social convention," Nara said. "Yes," Dorian agreed. "Is that a problem?" Nara looked at him standing there with his jaw set and his gray eyes fierce, ready to alienate himself from his entire social circle for the sake of her dignity, and she felt something break open in her chest. "You are the strangest man I have ever met," she said. "Is that a yes or a no?" It is a yes, but you need to understand what you are risking. This is not just about dinner seating. If you do this, people will assume we are involved romantically. They will talk, they will judge, and some of them will treat you the way they have always treated me. Are you prepared for that? I am not just prepared for it, I am inviting it, Dorian said. Because the truth is, Nara, I am not doing this solely for your benefit. I am doing it for mine as well. I told you weeks ago that I was half in love with you. That was a lie. I am completely in love with you. I am in love with your brilliance and your stubbornness, and the way you talk to trees as if they can hear you. I am in love with how you take your tea with too much honey, and how you get this little crease between your eyes when you are thinking hard about a problem. I am in love with you, and I am tired of pretending that is something I should be ashamed of. So yes, I am going to seat you beside me at the feast, and yes, people are going to know exactly what that means, and if they have a problem with it, they can take their opinions and their invitations and their judgment and go straight to whatever hell they believe in. The orchard was very quiet around them. A bee droned past, heavy with pollen. The sun was warm on Nara's shoulders. I am in love with you too, Nara said, and watched Dorian's eyes go wide with wonder. I have been trying not to be because it seemed like an excellent way to get my heart broken. But you keep doing things like defending me to Lady Wainwright, and learning the proper way to prune pear trees and looking at me as if I am someone worth looking at. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to help myself. Dorian crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "Please," Nara said, and then his mouth was on hers and nothing else mattered. He kissed her gently at first, as if she might break, but when she made a soft sound and pressed closer, he deepened the kiss into something that felt like a promise. His hands were warm on her face, his body solid against hers, and when they finally broke apart for air, they were both breathing hard. "That was even better than I imagined," Dorian said, resting his forehead against hers. "And I have been imagining it for months." "Only months," Nara teased. "I have been imagining it since you smiled at me in your study." "Then we have a great deal of time to make up for," Dorian said, and kissed her again. They stood in the orchard holding each other while the world moved around them, and for the first time in her life, Nara let herself believe that she might actually be allowed to keep this. The days leading up to the feast passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Dorian made no secret of their relationship, and the reaction was swift and predictable. Lady Wainwright sent a curt note declining her invitation. Lord Fairfax did the same. Several other landowners followed suit, their refusals couched in polite excuses but unmistakable in their message. "We will have a smaller gathering this year," Dorian said, reading through the responses. "But the people who matter will be there." The Suttons sent their acceptance with a note saying they looked forward to seeing Miss Greenfield again. 3 other landowners who had hired Nara to consult on their orchards also accepted. The final guest list was perhaps half the size of the previous year's feast, but Dorian seemed unconcerned. "Quality over quantity," he said, "and we will have an actual good harvest to celebrate. That is worth more than a room full of people who attend only to gossip." The morning of the feast dawned clear and golden, autumn sunlight slanting through trees heavy with fruit. The harvest had been extraordinary, the best in decades, and the estate workers had spent the past week picking and sorting apples and pears, until the storerooms were full to bursting. Nara arrived at the manor house in the afternoon, and a maid showed her to a room where a dress was laid out on the bed. Not her own patched wool, but something new, deep green silk that shimmered in the light. "Master Thornley had it made for you," the maid said shyly. "He said you should have something fine for tonight." Nara touched the fabric with careful fingers, overwhelmed by the gesture. No one had ever given her something so beautiful, so impractical, so clearly meant to make her feel valued. She put it on and it fit perfectly, the color making her green skin seem to glow. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, someone who looked like she belonged in a manor house instead of a cottage. When she descended to the dining hall, Dorian was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up as she approached, and the expression on his face made every moment of anxiety worth it. "You are beautiful," he said simply. "You take my breath away." "The dress is beautiful," Nara corrected. "I am just wearing it." "No," Dorian said, taking her hand. "You are beautiful. The dress is merely fortunate to be worn by you." The guests arrived, and Dorian welcomed them with genuine warmth. The dining hall looked splendid, decorated with branches of autumn leaves and baskets of apples, candles burning in sconces along the walls. And at the head of the table, 2 chairs sat side by side instead of one. When everyone had assembled, Dorian took Nara's hand and led her to those chairs. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "This year's feast is a celebration not just of a successful harvest, but of the person who made that harvest possible." Nara Greenfield took orchards that had been failing for years and brought them back to full production through skill, hard work, and knowledge that I could not have found anywhere else. She is the reason we have fruit to celebrate tonight. But more than that, she is the reason I remember why I love this estate and this work. She has reminded me that good things happen when you ignore other people's small-minded prejudices and instead focus on substance, skill, and character. So tonight, she sits beside me not as an employee or a consultant, but as my honored partner and the woman I love. If anyone here has a problem with that, you are welcome to leave now. The hall was silent. Nara felt every eye on her, felt the weight of judgment and surprise and calculation. Then Thomas Sutton started clapping and Margaret joined him, and one by one the other guests added their applause until the room rang with it. Dorian smiled and squeezed her hand. "Well," he murmured, "that went better than expected." "The evening is young," Nara murmured back. "Someone could still throw food." "Let them," Dorian said. "I will throw it back." The feast was magnificent, course after course of food prepared from the estate's harvest. Roasted pork with apple chutney, pear tarts glazed with honey, cider that sparkled gold in the candlelight. The conversation flowed easily, and if there were a few awkward moments when someone was not sure how to address Nara, Dorian smoothed them over with practiced ease. Margaret Sutton pulled Nara aside between courses. "I am glad you are here," she said quietly. "Not just because the food is wonderful, though it is, but because you make Dorian happy. I have known him since we were children, and I have not seen him this content in years. Anyone with eyes can see how much he cares for you." "I care for him too," Nara said. "More than I thought I was capable of caring for anyone." "Then hold on to that," Margaret said. "The people who matter will come around, and the ones who do not are not worth your time anyway." As the evening wore on and the wine flowed, the formality of the dinner relaxed into something warmer. People laughed, told stories, and more than one guest came to compliment Nara directly on her work. Thomas Sutton asked detailed questions about grafting techniques. Another landowner wanted to know if she would consider taking on his estate's neglected cherry trees, but not everyone was pleased. Near the end of the meal, a latecomer arrived, a lean man with cold eyes who introduced himself as Marcus Pemberton, a neighboring landowner whom Dorian had invited out of courtesy. He took in the seating arrangement with obvious disapproval, and spent the rest of the evening making pointed comments about tradition and proper society. When the final course had been cleared and some guests were beginning to make their farewells, Pemberton approached Dorian with a sneer barely concealed. "Making quite the statement tonight, Thornley," he said. "One wonders what your father would think, seeing his estate's table graced by such rustic company." "My father would think I was finally showing some sense," Dorian said coldly. He believed in rewarding merit, not in preserving outdated prejudices, and I would appreciate it if you kept your opinions to yourself, Pemberton. "I am merely noting what others will certainly say behind your back," Pemberton said. "That you have let your desperation for a decent harvest cloud your judgment, that you have confused professional gratitude with genuine affection, that you are making yourself a laughingstock by parading your orc laborer about as if she were a proper lady." Nara felt ice settle in her stomach. She had known this was coming, had braced herself for it, but hearing it spoken aloud still stung. Dorian's face went white with rage. "Get out," he said quietly. "I beg your pardon, get out of my house, now, and do not come back." "Really, Thornley, there is no need for dramatics. I am simply being honest. You are being cruel," Dorian interrupted. "And if you think I will tolerate anyone speaking about Nara that way in my home, you are sorely mistaken. Leave. Now." Pemberton's face flushed, but he left, his departure marked by a tense silence. Dorian turned to the remaining guests. "I apologize for that unpleasantness," he said. "But I want to be clear. Nara Greenfield is not my laborer, my employee, or my charity case. She is the woman I love, and anyone who cannot treat her with the respect she deserves is not welcome here." The silence stretched, and then Thomas Sutton raised his glass. "To Miss Greenfield," he said. "May her orchards always flourish and her company always be welcomed." "To Miss Greenfield," the others echoed, and the tension broke. Later, after the last guests had departed and the servants had cleared the tables, Dorian and Nara stood together in the empty hall. "I am sorry about Pemberton," Dorian said quietly. "I should have anticipated that someone might say something like that." "You cannot control what other people say," Nara said. "You can only control how you respond, and you responded by choosing me. That is all I need." "I will always choose you," Dorian said. "No matter what anyone says. I hope you know that." "I am starting to," Nara admitted. "It is strange being chosen. I am not sure I know how to do this." "Neither am I," Dorian said, "but I am willing to figure it out if you are." Nara kissed him then, there in the empty hall with candles burning low and the scent of apples still hanging in the air. "Yes," she said against his mouth. "I am willing." The following months brought their own challenges. Several landowners who had previously done business with Dorian withdrew their custom, and there were whispers in the village about his judgment. But there were also new opportunities. Farmers and smallholders, who had never felt comfortable approaching the wealthy estate owner, now came to him, drawn by his willingness to work with someone they saw as one of their own. Nara's consulting business grew beyond what she could manage alone, and she found herself training 2 apprentices, young women from Millbrook who wanted to learn orcharding. Dorian gave her full use of 3 of his fields to establish a nursery, and together they began growing saplings to sell to local farmers. Winter came again, and with it the slow, quiet work of planning for the next season. Nara spent more and more time at the manor house, until one day she realized she was living there more often than at her own cottage. Dorian had given her a room in the west wing, but she rarely slept there, preferring his bed and his warmth beside her. "Move in properly," he said one evening as they lay together watching firelight play across the ceiling. "Stop pretending you live somewhere else. Make this your home." "People will talk," Nara said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "People are already talking," Dorian pointed out. "We might as well give them something worth talking about." So Nara closed up her cottage and moved her few belongings to the manor house. She took over the room next to Dorian's study and filled it with books on horticulture, samples of different soils, sketches of orchard layouts. She made it hers, and slowly the manor house began to feel like home. Spring came again, and with it the bloom. The orchards burst into flower even more abundantly than the previous year, and Nara knew with certainty that this harvest would surpass even the last. The trees were healthy now, fully recovered from their years of neglect, and they responded to her continued care with generous growth. One morning in late spring, Dorian found her in the orchard making notes about bud development. He looked nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets, and when she asked what was wrong, he just shook his head. "Nothing is wrong," he said. "I just have something I need to ask you, and I am terrified of getting it wrong." "You can ask me anything," Nara said, setting down her notebook. Dorian took a breath, pulled his hands from his pockets, and dropped to one knee. Nara's heart stopped. "I am not good at speeches," Dorian said. "I practice this, but now that I am actually doing it, everything I planned to say has fled my mind. So I am just going to be honest. I love you. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You have made my life better in every possible way, and I cannot imagine a future that does not have you in it. I want to grow old with you. I want to tend these orchards with you for the next 40 years. I want to watch the seasons turn and see your face across the breakfast table every morning, and know that I get to fall asleep beside you every night. So I am asking, Nara Greenfield, will you marry me?" He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple gold with a small green stone set in it. "The stone is peridot," he said. "It reminded me of your skin. I had it made specially." Nara stared at him, at this man who had taken every prejudice and social barrier she had ever faced and simply refused to acknowledge them as valid. Who had chosen her over and over in small ways and large until she could not doubt that he meant it. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you." Dorian surged to his feet and kissed her, the ring still clutched in his hand, and they stood there in the blooming orchard holding each other while bees droned around them and petals drifted down like snow. The wedding preparations were an exercise in navigation. Some of Dorian's family expressed dismay, though none went so far as to refuse to attend. His mother, who lived in a distant province, sent a terse letter saying she hoped he knew what he was doing. His sister, younger and more open-minded, wrote back with congratulations and a promise to attend. Nara had no family to invite. Her parents had died years ago, and she had no siblings. But the Suttons stood up with her, and her 2 apprentices helped her choose a dress, and the local priest agreed to perform the ceremony after Dorian made a generous donation to the church roof fund. The wedding was held in early summer, in the orchard with the trees in full leaf and tiny fruits just beginning to form. It was a small gathering, perhaps 30 people, but everyone who came was genuinely happy to be there. Nara wore a dress of cream and green, and Dorian could not stop smiling. When the priest asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only silence and birdsong. When he pronounced them married, Dorian kissed Nara with such thorough joy that several guests laughed and applauded. The celebration afterward was relaxed and warm, more festival than formal reception. Long tables had been set up beneath the trees, laden with food and drink, and people ate and talked and danced to music provided by a trio of local musicians. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Dorian pulled Nara close for a slow dance. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," Nara said honestly. "You have given me so much. A home, work I love, respect, and now this. I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to thank me," Dorian said. Everything I have given you, you have given back tenfold. You saved my orchards, yes, but you also saved me from a life of hiding what I wanted because I was afraid of what other people might think. You taught me to be brave. That is worth more than I can ever repay." They danced under the stars while the orchard rustled around them, and Nara thought that maybe, just maybe, the world could change. Maybe prejudice could be challenged and overcome. Maybe love could be stronger than social convention. Maybe an orc woman and a human man could build a life together and find happiness in defiance of everyone who said it was impossible. The summer passed in a haze of contentment. Nara continued her work with the orchards and her growing consulting business. Dorian managed the estate and supported her in every way he could. They worked together, ate together, slept tangled in each other's arms, and slowly built a life that was theirs. The second harvest under Nara's care was even more abundant than the first. The trees groaned with fruit, and it took twice as many workers to pick it all. Dorian walked through the orchard with an expression of wonder, touching the laden branches as if he could not quite believe they were real. 2 years ago, I was ready to cut these trees down, he said. Now look at them. They just needed someone to care for them properly, Nara said. Trees are like people that way. They respond to attention and patience. Then I am very glad I found someone with both, Dorian said, pulling her close. Planning for that year's harvest feast began months in advance. This time, Dorian wanted it to be a true celebration, open to everyone who had supported them. The guest list grew to nearly 50 people, including farmers and smallholders and artisans alongside the handful of landowners who had remained friendly. It will be the largest feast we have ever hosted, Dorian said, looking over the preparations. And the first where I do not care at all what the so-called important people think. I am inviting people I actually like, people who have shown themselves to be decent, and people who helped make this harvest possible. That is what matters. Nara helped with the planning, suggesting dishes that would showcase the orchard's produce. Apple tarts and pear cakes, cider and preserves, roasted pork with apple glaze. The menu was a celebration of the land and the work that had saved it. The night before the feast, Nara stood in the orchard alone, running her hands over bark that was now smooth and healthy. The trees were dark shapes against the star-filled sky, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for them. They had brought her to this place, to this life, to this happiness. She had healed them, and in doing so had healed something in herself. There you are, Dorian said, appearing beside her. I should have known I would find you here. Just saying good night to them, Nara said. They deserve it after the season they gave us. They deserve you, Dorian said. As do I, though I am not sure what I did to earn such luck. You smiled at an orc woman when everyone else would have looked away, Nara said simply. That was all it took. The day of the feast dawned bright and clear, autumn sunshine pouring over the estate like liquid gold. Servants worked all morning preparing the dining hall, and the kitchens were chaos as cooks worked to produce enough food for the crowd. Nara put on a new dress, deep blue this time with silver embroidery at the cuffs, and helped Dorian greet guests as they arrived. The mood was celebratory from the start. People marveled at the decorations, at the baskets of perfect apples and pears arranged throughout the hall, at the sheer abundance of everything. When everyone had assembled and taken their seats, Dorian stood at the head of the table with Nara beside him. Welcome, he said, his voice warm. Thank you all for being here to celebrate what has been an extraordinary year. 3 years ago, my orchards were dying. I had tried everything I could think of to save them, and nothing worked. I was ready to give up, to cut them down and admit defeat. Then I met someone who saw what I could not see, who knew what I did not know, and who was willing to take a chance on bringing them back to life. He turned to look at Nara, his expression soft with love. My wife has given me more than a successful harvest. She has given me hope, partnership, and a reason to believe that good things happen when you stop listening to prejudice and start listening to wisdom. Everything you see here tonight, every apple and pear and drop of cider, exists because she refused to give up on something that everyone else had written off as lost. I am grateful beyond words that she chose to share her life with me. The hall erupted in applause, and Nara felt tears prick her eyes. She stood beside Dorian, looking out at the faces gathered around the table, and saw acceptance there. Not from everyone, perhaps, but from enough people to matter. She saw respect and genuine affection and celebration, not just of the harvest, but of the work and the partnership that had made it possible. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely carrying over the applause. "Thank you for being here, and for giving me a chance when I was certain no one would." The feast was everything a celebration should be. The food was excellent, the conversation lively, the mood joyous. People ate until they were full and then ate more, exclaiming over the quality of the fruit and the skill of the cooks. Wine and cider flowed freely, and as the evening progressed, the formality dissolved into something warmer and more genuine. Near the end of the meal, Thomas Sutton stood and raised his glass. "I want to say something," he said. 3 years ago, I thought I knew everything about managing an estate. I thought experience and tradition were enough. Then I watched Dorian hire an orc woman to save his orchards, and I thought he had lost his mind. But he was right, and I was wrong, and I am man enough to admit it. Miss Greenfield, now Mrs. Thornley, taught me that skill matters more than appearance, that knowledge matters more than convention, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is admit you do not know everything and hire someone who does. My own orchards are thriving now because I followed Dorian's example. So I am raising a glass to both of them, for having the courage to ignore what everyone said they should do and doing what was right instead. "Hear, hear," several voices called out, and everyone drank. Margaret Sutton stood next. "I want to add something," she said. "I have known Dorian since we were children, and I have never seen him as happy as he is now. Love is not always convenient, and it does not always follow the rules we expect it to. But when you find it, real and true and worth fighting for, you hold on to it. Dorian and Nara have shown us all what that looks like, and I for one am honored to call them both friends." More applause, more toasts, and Nara felt her heart swell with gratitude and joy. This was what acceptance looked like. This was what it meant to be valued for who you were rather than judged for what you looked like. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart with promises to visit soon, Nara and Dorian found themselves alone in the orchard again. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the rows of trees, and the air was cool with the promise of the coming winter. "We did it," Dorian said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. 2 years ago, I invited you to a feast and hoped you might help my orchards. Now you are my wife, those orchards are thriving, and we just hosted a celebration that people will talk about for years." "They will talk about the orc woman who married the landowner," Nara said. "That is what they will remember." "Let them," Dorian said. "Every time they talk about it, they will have to admit that it worked, that we are happy, that the estate prospers, that love and skill and partnership matter more than tradition. We are changing minds, Nara. Slowly, perhaps, but we are doing it." Nara leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would have this," she said quietly. "A home, work I love, respect, someone who loves me exactly as I am. It still does not feel quite real." "It is real," Dorian promised. "And it is yours. For as long as you want it. Then I want it forever, Nara said. They stood together under the autumn moon while the orchard rustled around them, and Nara thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a single invitation she had been certain was a mistake. Through seasons of hard work and growing trust, through love discovered and defended and celebrated, to this moment of perfect contentment. The trees stood witness around them, healthy and strong, their branches still heavy with the last fruits of the harvest. In the spring, they would bloom again, and in the summer they would bear fruit, and the cycle would continue year after year as long as someone was there to tend them. Nara had saved these trees, but in a way, they had saved her too. They had given her a purpose, a place, a reason to believe that she could be valued for what she could do rather than dismissed for what she was. "Come inside," Dorian said softly. "It is getting cold, and tomorrow we have 100 things to do. The storage cellars need organizing, and there are orders to fill, and 3 more landowners want to consult with you about their orchards." "Tomorrow," Nara agreed. "But tonight, just for a little longer, I want to stand here and remember what this feels like, being happy, being home." "We will have many more nights like this," Dorian promised. "Many more harvests, many more feasts, many more moments of standing in the orchard and marveling at how lucky we are." "This is not an ending, Nara. It is a beginning." She turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting apples and cider and love. "Then I cannot wait to see what comes next," she said. They walked back to the manor house hand in hand, leaving the orchard to its silver moonlight and autumn peace. Behind them, the trees stood in orderly rows, proof that care and patience and refusing to give up on something could create beauty from despair. Ahead of them, lights glowed warm in the manor house windows, promising comfort and rest and the life they had built together. Nara had thought the invitation was a mistake, a clerical error that had accidentally included her name. But Dorian had smiled at her that first day in his study, had seen her for who she was rather than what she appeared to be, and everything had changed. He had invited her not just to a feast but into his life, his home, his heart, and she had found the courage to accept. Now, 2 harvests and a lifetime of choices later, she stood beside him as his wife and partner, co-host of a feast that celebrated not just successful crops, but the triumph of substance over prejudice. The doubters had been proven wrong by the evidence of the orchard's bounty, and the people who mattered had welcomed her. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for, and it was real. Inside the manor house, the servants were cleaning up from the feast, their voices carrying softly through the halls. Dorian and Nara climbed the stairs to their room, past portraits of Thornley ancestors who would never have imagined an orc woman joining their lineage. The thought made Nara smile. She was making her own history now, writing a new story for this estate and everyone who would come after. "What are you smiling about?" Dorian asked as they reached their door. "Everything," Nara said simply. "Absolutely everything." They went inside together, closing the door on the night and the celebration and the world beyond. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to prove that the choice they had made was right. But tonight, they had this. Each other, their home, and the orchards outside that stood as living proof that care could overcome neglect, that patience could heal damage, and that love could flourish in the most unexpected places. The years ahead would bring their own seasons, their own harvests good and poor, their own struggles and triumphs. There would be more feasts, more consultations, more trees planted and pruned and nurtured. There would be children, perhaps, running through the orchard rows and learning to tend the trees themselves. There would be continued resistance from some quarters and continued acceptance from others. There would be all the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of a life built together against expectation. But tonight, in this moment, there was only peace and certainty, and the knowledge that every choice that had led them here had been worth making. Nara had come to return an invitation she thought was a mistake. She had stayed because a man had smiled at her and seen past the surface to the skill and worth beneath. And from that small beginning, they had built something extraordinary. She fell asleep that night in Dorian's arms, listening to his breathing slow and even beside her, and dreamed of apple blossoms drifting down like snow over orchards that stretched to the horizon. In her dream, she walked between the rows with her hand in his, and every tree they passed burst into bloom at their touch, white and pink flowers opening to the sun. It was a good dream, a dream of growth and renewal and the promise of abundant harvests to come. And when she woke in the morning to autumn sunlight streaming through the windows and Dorian's sleepy smile, she knew that the reality was even better. The invitation had not been a mistake. It had been the beginning of everything.